There are roads that take you places, and there are roads that take things from you. They're not on any map, but every trucker knows their names. They whisper about them in hushed tones over lukewarm coffee at 3 a.m. But what if the things they whisper about aren't just myths? What if the road itself is a living, breathing thing? A predator that hunts in the dark? Today, we're going to tell you the story of Route 666 and a young trucker who thought he could outrun its curse. But in the end, he learned that on this road, no one ever really gets away. The low hum of his engine felt like the only anchor to reality in the wide, open expanse of the empty road. He couldn't shake the old man's words. The wind whipped at his rig, a sound like a whisper, and for a second he thought he heard his own name carried on the breeze. The old man's words were just the beginning. The low, familiar hum of the diesel engine was the only constant on this lonely stretch of highway. For decades, men like Sam had driven these roads, chasing the sunrise and dodging the shadows. He'd seen it all: phantom hitchhikers, impossible weather, and the kind of solitude that warps a man's mind. But Route 66 was different. It had a reputation. A hungry, whispering reputation that he'd always steered clear of. He'd always told the rookies it was one of those true horror stories that actually happened out there in the vast, empty dark. Today, though, he was sharing a cup of coffee with a new kid named Jake at a roadside diner, and the low static on the diner's CB radio felt like a warning. Jake, young and eager, just laughed it off. He was hauling his first big load and he had to go through that very road. "Come on, Sam," he said. "It's just a number. It's no different from any other road, is it?" But Sam's gaze was heavy. He took a long, slow sip of his black coffee, the air thick with unspoken dread. The wind outside howled, a sound like a distant mournful wail, and the low chatter of the CB cut in and out with garbled whispers and strange, metallic clicks that no one seemed to notice but him. Jake felt his optimism fade, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The silence of the night and Sam's haunted look were a prelude to a genuinely chilling true horror stories that actually happened. Sam leaned in, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that cut through the diner's easy noise. "Listen to me, boy. That road doesn't just get you from point A to point B. It gets inside your cab. It plays tricks on you, uses your own loneliness against you. Folks who disappear on that road don't just get lost. They become part of it. The road takes them, and what's left? That's just the shadows they leave behind. Just don't stop. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, you keep that rig moving." Jake simply nodded, but the easy confidence in his eyes had started to crack. He finished his coffee in silence, paid the bill, and left the diner. As he pulled back onto the highway, the air grew thick, and the faint, low static from the diner's CB seemed to follow him. The black asphalt of Route 666 stretched out under the pale glow of the moon, a river of loneliness that Jake was now floating on. He'd driven for what felt like hours, the low hum of his truck's engine a hypnotic rhythm that was slowly lulling him into a sense of false security. But then he saw it. In his rearview mirror, a pair of dim, yellowed headlights appeared. They weren't a common sight out here at this hour, and Jake, remembering Sam's ominous words, felt a flicker of unease. He dismissed it as just another rig on the road, a fellow traveler in the night. He watched the lights grow closer, a silent pursuit, but the truck itself never seemed to appear in his side mirrors. It was just the lights, like a pair of distant, baleful eyes in the darkness. He accelerated, wanting to put distance between himself and this quiet follower. His engine roared, eating up the miles, but when he glanced in the mirror again, the lights were still there, holding the exact same distance. There was no sound of a rival engine, no diesel roar, just the lights, persistent and silent. This felt like one of those scary trucker stories real-life veterans whispered about. Jake gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The road was straight, the view was clear, but he couldn't see the phantom truck itself. He hit the brakes, a quick, sharp tap to test its presence. The rig behind him should have swerved or at least flashed its lights, but nothing happened. When he sped up again, the lights remained, a ghost on his tail. A cold dread, a feeling of being hunted, settled deep in his gut. This was no ordinary road. It was a dark and dangerous place from the kind of scary trucker stories real life had to offer. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a reflection, a trick of the light. But when a bend in the road offered a clear view behind him, there was nothing there at all. The road was empty. Jake slowed his truck to a near crawl, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a long, deep breath and told himself it was over. Just a momentary delusion. He checked his side and rearview mirrors one last time. Nothing. He put his foot back on the gas. That's when the headlights appeared again, this time right on his bumper, a sudden blinding pair of yellow eyes. He slammed on the brakes, the sound of screeching tires a violent punctuation to the silence. He turned his head, staring directly out the back window. The lights were gone. The road was empty. The truck was gone, but something was still there. Jake's heart hammered a frantic beat against his ribs. He sat in his truck for a long moment, the silence of the empty road now a heavy, oppressive blanket. He needed a break, a place with lights and people to ground himself and shake the unnerving vision of the phantom truck. Up ahead, he spotted a small, unlit sign for an all-night gas station. It was a lifeline. He pulled off the highway, the tires crunching on loose gravel, and saw a classic, single pump station with an old, flickering neon sign. This was one of the many unsettling highway horror stories he would later recount. He killed the engine and sat in the sudden, deafening quiet. The air was unnaturally still, the only sound the low, buzzing hum of the neon sign and the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets that felt out of sync with the world. He got out of the cab, his boots thudding on the cracked asphalt. A chilling cold, far colder than the night air should have been, seemed to emanate from the ground itself. He noticed the time on his dashboard read 2:37 a.m., but it felt like hours had passed since the phantom truck disappeared. The sense of temporal distortion, of time slowing down, was one of the classic highway horror stories he'd heard. Inside, a single light bulb cast a sickly yellow glow over dusty shelves. The old man behind the counter didn't look up, just gestured to the pump. Jake filled his tank, the pump gauge ticking up with a metallic sound. As he went to pay, the old man finally looked up, his eyes a murky, depthless black that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. He handed over a few bills, and the old man gave him a receipt, his long, skeletal fingers brushing Jake's hand. The touch was as cold and hard as stone. Jake quickly went back to his rig, a strange urgency now compelling him to leave. The unnerving quiet, the unsettling cold, and the old man's dead eyes all screamed at him to get back on the road. He threw the truck into gear, the engine roaring to life and cutting through the unnatural silence. He didn't look back as he pulled out onto the highway, his foot heavy on the gas pedal. He just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. After a few miles, the feeling of dread began to recede, and he risked a glance in his rearview mirror to see if the strange rig was back. The road behind him was empty. He then looked for the sign for the gas station. It was gone. He looked back at his dash. Only 10 minutes had passed. The gas station was gone, but the receipt was real. The receipt from the vanishing gas station was folded neatly in Jake's cup holder. The thin paper felt like an anchor to a reality that was rapidly slipping away. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, not by a truck, but by something else entirely. After another long, tense hour, he pulled into a deserted rest area. the sign for which was so old, the letters had long ago faded to a ghostly white. The place was a forgotten time capsule, with empty, wind-whistling bathrooms and picnic tables carved with decades of names and dates. This was the most chilling of his paranormal road encounters. He got out to stretch his legs, the crisp night air doing little to soothe his frayed nerves. The strange, unnatural cold he had felt at the gas station was back, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. As he passed a trash can, something caught his eye. A small, tattered, leather-bound book. It was a trucker's logbook, a relic from a time before digital logs. Curiosity and a strange compulsion he couldn't explain made him pick it up. The cover felt impossibly cold to the touch, and the pages were brittle and yellowed with age. Flipping through it, he saw a familiar pattern: dates, mileage, and destinations. But the last few pages were different. The handwriting, once neat and tidy, had become frantic and spidery. The entries had stopped being about holes and started to be about fear. The author, a man named Jesse, wrote of a phantom rig that followed him, a gas station that disappeared, and a strange cold that wouldn't leave his cab. The parallels to his own night were terrifying, and a realization hit Jake with the force of a punch to the gut. These weren't just common occurrences. These were paranormal road encounters that were happening to him, too. Jake's hands trembled as he turned to the very last page. The ink was faded, but the message was clear. It wasn't a log of a haul or a rest stop. It was a desperate, final account of a man who realized he wasn't just driving on a road, but was trapped inside a nightmare. Jesse's final entry described a figure in the rearview mirror, a tall, gaunt thing with glowing eyes that had finally found him. The logbook ended there, with a frantic scrawl that said, "It's here now. It's looking for me. It knows my name." The final entry wasn't a note, it was a warning. The chilling warning from the logbook was a lead weight in Jake's stomach. He tossed the book onto the passenger seat, not wanting to touch it anymore, but unable to throw it away. He drove on, the highway now feeling less like a road and more like a long, dark hallway leading to an unknown terror. The air grew thick and heavy, and a sudden, unnatural fog rolled in. A dense, soupy white blanket that swallowed his high beams and reduced the world to a narrow tunnel of gray. His wipers screeched against the condensation that instantly coated the windshield, but it was no use. He slowed to a crawl, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm in his ears, trying to pierce the veil of the mist. That's when he saw her. A figure standing on the shoulder of the road, wrapped in a thin, pale shawl that fluttered in the non-existent wind. A woman, her head bowed, hitchhiking in the middle of a killer fog on a road known for killing. Jake's mind screamed at him to keep going, to obey the dead man's logbook and Sam's warning. But a deeper, more human part of him, the part that couldn't ignore someone in distress, told him to stop. He pulled over, the brakes hissing in the cold air. She got in without a word, the passenger door opening and closing with a silent, deliberate motion. She didn't look at him, but stared straight ahead, her face a pale blur in the dim light of the dashboard. An unearthly cold, far beyond the chill of the fog, filled the cab, and Jake saw his own breath mist in the air. The temperature gauge on the dashboard began to drop rapidly. Her presence was a physical thing, an oppressive weight that felt like a 100-year-old grave had just opened next to him. These were the kinds of unsettling moments that made for creepy roadside encounters from asphalt shadows. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. He drove for another half-mile, desperate to get out of the fog. The unnatural cold in the cab was making him shiver uncontrollably. He risked a quick glance to his right, just to check on his silent passenger. The seat was empty. The door was closed. The shawl she was wearing was gone. But the oppressive, bone-deep cold remained. a tangible thing that seemed to cling to the upholstery. A trail of condensation, as if a body had been sitting there for an hour, was slowly evaporating from the passenger window. He had become a character in one of the most unsettling, creepy roadside encounters from Asphalt Shadows. Her cold presence left an impossible question behind. The chill from the vanishing hitchhiker had finally faded, but the phantom cold in the cab remained, a subtle, psychological thing that made the skin on the back of Jake's neck prickle. He was driving in a daze, his mind still trying to process the impossible. He needed to find a town, any town, to get off this cursed highway. Up ahead, a sign materialized out of the darkness. It was old, rusted, and unlit, but the letters were painted a stark, spectral white. Blackwood Falls, next right, 2 miles. A wave of relief washed over him. He wasn't alone after all. This was the kind of twisted signpost that was legendary in highway horror stories. He checked his GPS to confirm the turn, but the screen was just a dead black rectangle. The signal was gone. He'd seen something similar happen with other rigs, a peculiar side effect of Route 66, but it felt different this time. The GPS wasn't just malfunctioning, it felt actively suppressed. He was alone with the road now, the only direction being what the highway itself told him. He trusted the old sign, though, a beacon of normalcy in a night that had been anything but. He put on his blinker and took the turn. The road was narrow and overgrown, the tree branches on either side forming a canopy that blotted out the moonlight, plunging the world into a deep, claustrophobic darkness. His headlights cut through the void, revealing nothing but more trees and a single, endless road. His anxiety began to mount again. The distance marker on the side of the road showed 1 mile, then half mile, then quarter mile. But after that, the numbers stopped. The trees grew thicker, twisting into grotesque shapes in the beam of his lights, like gnarled hands reaching for his cab. He looked at the dashboard clock. He'd been driving on this road for what felt like 10 minutes. Where was the town? This felt like one of those highway horror stories where the road itself was the monster. Panic began to set in as the road continued to stretch on, the trees never giving way to houses or a town square. There was no sign of Blackwood Falls, only the oppressive silence and the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched from the dark woods. He slammed on the brakes, the sudden stop a violent jerk that threw his head forward. He sat in the silence, listening. The wind had died, and the world was completely still. He looked down at his GPS again. The screen was still black. The sign had lied. The road didn't lead to Blackwood Falls. It had simply led him deeper. The road didn't lead to a town. It led to something else. The dead end of the fake road spat Jake back out onto the main highway, the feeling of unease now a permanent companion. He was back on Route 66, the sign for Blackwood Falls a silent, malevolent joke in the rearview mirror. He was exhausted, his sanity frayed at the edges, and all he wanted was to find a truck stop or a diner. Up ahead, a small, rusted sign by the side of the road read, "Mile Marker 13. He knew the number. Sam had mentioned it in the diner, a spot where countless wrecks and unexplained disappearances had occurred. A chill ran down his spine. This was just another entry in a long line of terrifying what truckers see at 3 a.m. on empty highways. As soon as he passed the marker, his truck lurched and a cascade of warning lights lit up the dashboard. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died, plunging the cab into a suffocating silence, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of the engine cooling. He was stranded at the exact spot he had been warned about. He turned the key, but the engine wouldn't turn over. It was completely dead. This was exactly the kind of unnerving incident that made for what truckers see at 3 a.m. on empty highways. It felt less like a mechanical failure and more like an intentional act. He reached for his CB radio, desperate to hail a passing rig. The screen was dark, the static silent. He jiggled the antenna, but there was no life. Just a dead piece of equipment in a dead vehicle. Suddenly, a low hum came from the speaker. It wasn't the sound of a channel coming to life, but a kind of inhuman whisper, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once. It grew louder, a cacophony of distorted pleas and chilling cries that made the hair on Jake's arms stand on end. He grabbed the mic, but no matter how many times he tried to speak, the radio would not transmit. The voices continued, a jumbled, overlapping mess of sounds. He could make out words, fragments of phrases: "Get out," "Help us," "Don't stop here." The voices sounded terrified, desperate and lost. They weren't talking about themselves, they were talking about him. The engine tried to turn over again, a single, weak cough, but the voices on the radio rose in pitch and volume, a wave of pure sonic terror that crashed over him. They weren't talking to him, they were screaming. The chilling, dead phone line was a confirmation of his deepest fear. Jake wasn't just on a haunted road, he was a target. The voice on the phone had given him a warning, and now he understood that being stranded in his truck was a trap. He had to get out, on foot, and find safety. He grabbed his duffel bag and a flashlight, the beam cutting a weak, jittery circle in the darkness as he slammed the heavy cab door shut. He began walking, his boots crunching on the gravel of the shoulder, every shadow a potential threat, every distant sound a source of terror. His heart sank when he saw the screen. No service. Of course, he was in the middle of nowhere on a road that didn't want him. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, a useless rectangle of plastic and glass. But then it lit up again, a sudden, sharp vibration on the upholstery. The screen showed an incoming call, but the number was blocked, just a series of zeros. Who could be calling? He felt an icy dread crawl up his spine. This was a step beyond anything he had heard in even the most outlandish, true horror stories that actually happened on the road. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button. Maybe it was a hallucination, another one of the road's twisted games. He took a deep breath and, against all reason, answered the call. The line was a mess of static and crackles, but through the noise, a faint, distorted voice came through, thin as a thread. "Help us," it rasped. It sounded like the voice of a man, terrified and in pain. "He's coming." The voice was so full of agony, it was almost unbearable to listen to. Jake opened his mouth to ask who he was, but the voice continued, a new urgency in its tone. This was a direct, terrifying communication that fit all the descriptions of true horror stories that actually happened. The words were strained, as if the speaker were fighting to get them out. "Don't stop. He finds you when you stop." The voice grew faint, punctuated by what sounded like a series of violent, gurgling screams in the background. "He's in the cab. He's in the cab with you now." The line went dead with a high-pitched squeal, leaving only the sound of Jake's own ragged breathing. He looked wildly around his truck, at the empty passenger seat, at the rearview mirror, at the shadows dancing outside the windshield. There was no one. The fear was a living thing in his throat. The voice on the phone knew exactly where he was. The chilling, dead phone line was a confirmation of his deepest fear. Jake wasn't just on a haunted road, he was a target. The voice on the phone had given him a warning, and now he understood that being stranded in his truck was a trap. He had to get out, on foot, and find safety. He grabbed his duffel bag and a flashlight, the beam cutting a weak, jittery circle in the darkness as he slammed the heavy cab door shut. He began walking, his boots crunching on the gravel of the shoulder, every shadow a potential threat, every distant sound a source of terror. Up ahead, a faint, flickering light cut through the blackness, a pale, anemic glow that gave him a surge of desperate hope. It was a motel, A two-story structure with a sign that was missing half its letters. It was old and clearly abandoned, but the single light coming from a second-story window promised some sort of shelter. The doors hung loose on their hinges, groaning in the faint breeze. He entered the lobby, his flashlight beam sweeping over a dusty check-in desk and a pile of ancient magazines. The silence was immense, broken only by the sound of his own heavy breathing. This was exactly the kind of place that spawned creepy roadside encounters from asphalt shadows. He made his way up a creaking staircase, each step a groan of protest in the oppressive quiet. The air grew cold, not the unnatural cold of the highway, but a stale, dead cold of a forgotten space. He reached the second floor and saw the source of the light. A bare bulb in a vacant room flickered on and off, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He didn't dare get closer. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, was stronger here than anywhere else on the road. As Jake stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, he saw it. A dark shape moved in the window of the room with the flickering light. A tall, slender figure, a living shadow that seemed to stretch and distort as the light bulb flickered. It was watching him. He instinctively ducked back behind a pillar, his mind screaming at him to run. He risked a second glance. The figure was still there, but now it was leaning forward. It was no longer just a shadow in the glass. It had a face. A gaunt, impossibly thin face with two pinpricks of light for eyes that seemed to burn straight into his soul. The man in the window was no longer just a reflection. Jake ran. He burst out of the abandoned motel lobby, not looking back. The image of the gaunt, watching face seared into his mind. He didn't stop until he was back at his truck, fumbling with the keys to open the door. His hands trembling so badly he could barely get the key into the lock. He scrambled into the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it, as if a thin sheet of metal could protect him from the monstrosity he'd just seen. He didn't care that the truck wouldn't start. He just wanted to be inside, to feel a sense of security, no matter how false. He slumped into the driver's seat, his breathing ragged. The silence of the cab a small comfort after the chilling encounter in the motel. He was in his own space now, his fortress. He was safe. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and terror. He had to believe that, or he would lose his mind completely. It was just another one of the many scary trucker stories real-life veterans told, and he was getting a first-hand account. He felt for a moment like the hero of his own story, a man who had faced down an impossible horror and survived. He risked a glance at the rearview mirror, checking for movement behind him. He saw the empty road, the silent night, and the blackness of the trees. He let out a long, shaky breath, the tension in his shoulders finally starting to release. He was safe. He was alone. Then he saw it, reflected in the glass of the rearview mirror, but not outside his truck. It was inside the cab, directly behind his seat. A face. It was the same one he had seen in the motel window, only now it was impossibly close. It was a gaunt, skeletal face, its skin a stretched and yellowed parchment over sharp, protruding bones. The mouth was a dark, jagged slit, and the eyes were not eyes at all, but two pinpricks of brilliant, malevolent white light that glowed with a sickening intensity. The reflection was slightly distorted, as if seen through water, but there was no mistaking the chilling truth. This thing was in his cab with him, right now, its horrifying visage reflected in the very glass that was meant to show him the road behind him. He sat frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. This was a classic scary trucker story's real life that would become his personal nightmare. The eyes staring back weren't his, and they weren't human. Jake's blood ran cold. He sat frozen, staring into the rearview mirror. But the face was gone. The reflection was just his own, a pale, terrified face staring back at him. The impossible apparition of the creature had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He tore his gaze away from the mirror, breathing a frantic sigh of relief. The truck felt empty again, but the suffocating feeling of a recent presence still lingered, a thick, nauseating air that no amount of ventilation could clear. He had to get out of the cab, to put distance between himself and this cursed place, no matter how dangerous the road was. This was a new and terrifying chapter in his highway horror stories. He fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to start the engine, but the truck remained dead. He had to get out and find help. He had to run. As if in response to his panicked thoughts, the truck's radio, which he had ripped the cord from and thrown across the cab, suddenly sputtered to life. A low, distorted hum filled the silence, followed by a series of impossible sounds. It wasn't static, it was music. A slow, mournful tune that sounded like a funeral dirge played on an ancient, warped record. This was a new kind of terror, a soundscape from a world that wasn't his. The music faded, replaced by a low, malevolent voice that spoke with a chillingly calm tone. "Don't bother, friend," the voice said, its tone a low, sibilant whisper. "You won't get far on foot." The voice chuckled, a dry, rattling sound like bones rubbing together. "The road doesn't want you to leave, it wants you to stay and to watch what is about to happen." Jake's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a ghost call or radio static. This was a direct communication from the entity that was tormenting him. This was the kind of thing that gave rise to all those highway horror stories. The voice on the radio began to describe a car crash, the details unnervingly specific. It described a blue sedan, a family of 4, an oncoming semi. It painted a vivid, sickening picture of a tragedy about to unfold just up the road. "You are just a few miles away," the voice whispered, "and you have a front row seat." Jake sat, paralyzed with fear, unable to move. He looked out his windshield, and through the blackness of the night, he saw them. A pair of headlights in the distance, growing larger and larger. The sound of a semi's horn, a blaring, frantic call. The voice on the radio wasn't telling him about a past event. It was predicting the future. The voice on the radio wasn't a warning, it was a threat. The blaring horn and the subsequent sickening crunch of metal faded into the night. Jake sat in the cab, his body trembling, the silence now a witness to the tragedy he had just heard unfold. The voice on the radio was gone, but the horrific vision of the crash it had described was burned into his mind. He couldn't stay here, he had to run. He had to find a way to get the truck started. But no matter how many times he turned the key, the engine was a dead thing. He slammed his palm on the steering wheel in frustration. He had to get out of the cab. He jumped out of the cab, his feet hitting the asphalt in a frantic sprint toward the single-eye, flickering light in the distance. He had to believe it was a real place this time, not a phantom. The light grew into a familiar sight, a gas station, identical in layout to the one that had vanished hours before. He felt a wave of nausea. Could this be the same place? He approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. The smell of damp, sickly sweet air hung heavy, and the same unnatural cold that had followed him since the hitchhiker's disappearance was back, but stronger this time. He saw no one, no cars, and no signs of life. The place was a mausoleum. He walked to the pump, and his eyes fell on a faint, ethereal glow coming from the pump's base. It was a shimmering, otherworldly light, and in its faint glow, he could see them. Shadows, not the shadows of the night, but deep, inky black shapes that clung to the asphalt, shifting and writhing as if in agony. They were the souls of the truckers the road had claimed, and they were trapped here. This was not a gas station, it was a prison for lost souls. A cursed place where paranormal road encounters were the main attraction. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The gas station he had been to before hadn't vanished. He had simply been released from it, only for the road to trap him again. He looked down at the receipt in his pocket. It was real, a souvenir from hell. The shadows on the ground began to stretch and contort, reaching for his boots. He felt a terrible, soul-wrenching emptiness from them, a feeling of pure, unending despair. They were not just trapped here. They were a part of the trap itself, waiting for a new soul to join them. A figure materialized in the window of the gas station's office. It was the old man, his eyes glowing with that same malevolent light. He was smiling. This was one of the most terrifying paranormal road encounters he would ever know. The shadows were not just watching, they were hungry. Jake backed away from the cursed gas station, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. The shadows on the asphalt seemed to writhe, reaching for him like silent, grasping hands. He sprinted back to his truck, not daring to look back at the old man's chilling smile. He slammed the door, locked it, and sat in the suffocating silence. His mind raced. He was trapped. The truck was a magnet for these horrors, and he was a prisoner inside of it. He had to get it started. He had to keep moving. He couldn't become one of the shadows. He turned the key, and to his immense surprise, the engine sputtered to life, a rough, coughing roar, relief so immense it almost made him weep, washed over him. The road was releasing him, for now. He threw the rig into gear and roared out of the gas station's parking lot, leaving the hungry shadows behind. He didn't care where he was going, only that he was moving. He watched the fuel gauge, the needle firmly on EF, a testament to the gas he had just pumped, a gas he now knew was an empty promise. He had to get to a real station, a place with light and people. Minutes turned into a grueling, tense hour. The road was empty, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of his tires on the asphalt. He felt a phantom chill in the cab, the cold presence of the road itself, a constant, nagging reminder that he was still in its grasp. He glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle was now at 3/4. He hadn't been driving long enough for that kind of burn. He told himself it was just a mechanical fault, but his gut told him otherwise. This was the work of the road, the same entity responsible for all the highway horror stories. It was toying with him, bleeding his resources to force him to stop again. The needle kept falling, not slowly, but in sudden, precipitous drops. Half a tank, quarter tank. His heart pounded with each lurch of the needle. He had to stop, and he knew it. He was being guided to a particular place, a new trap. He saw the needle drop past E and into the red. He had less than 10 miles before the truck died. He felt a cold dread as he watched the gauge. It wasn't just dropping, it was being consumed. The tank was a bottomless void. He put his foot down, desperate to reach a town before the truck gave out. But he was losing the race. He looked down one last time before the engine sputtered and died. The gauge was not just on empty, it was below empty. The needle pointed at an impossible, terrifying nothing. The gas was gone, but something had taken its place. The engine coughed its final, dying breath, and the truck rolled to a silent stop on the shoulder of the road. Jake's heart sank into his stomach. He was once again stranded. His fuel gauge pointed at a terrifying nothingness. He was alone with the darkness and the gnawing feeling that this was no accident. The road had deliberately drained his tank, leaving him vulnerable. The silence was immense, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of his own terrified heart. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and tried to gather his composure. He wasn't going to wait around for another haunting reflection or a phone call from the dead. He was going to walk. He grabbed his duffel bag and his flashlight, his resolve hardening into a cold, desperate courage. He opened the cab door and stepped out, the night air hitting him like a wall. He aimed the beam of his flashlight into the blackness of the woods that lined the road, a dense, ancient forest that seemed to swallow the light. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, felt like a silent, approaching threat. That's when he heard it. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind. It was singing, a low, ethereal harmony, a chorus of voices that sounded impossibly far away, yet unnervingly close. It was a beautiful sound, but filled with a profound sorrow and a chilling, inhuman quality. The voices were clear and pure, but the melody was broken and discordant, like a song sung by people who no longer remembered how to breathe. The sound seemed to be coming from deep within the forest, a strange and unsettling siren call that was as captivating as it was terrifying. It was the latest in a series of creepy roadside encounters from Asphalt Shadows. Jake stood frozen on the shoulder of the road, mesmerized by the unholy music. The song seemed to be telling a story, a tale of despair and loss, but the words were unintelligible. The voices rose in pitch and volume, the harmony becoming more desperate, a chorus of suffering that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. It wasn't a joyful sound, it was a lament, a feeling of dread, of profound sorrow washed over him, a sense of loss that wasn't his own. He realized the song was a mourning. Their song wasn't a hymn, it was a dirge. The mournful dirge from the woods faded as Jake stumbled back onto the asphalt, his mind reeling from the impossible, unsettling sound. He didn't want to get any closer to the woods. He had to keep moving, but he had no rig. He was alone, on foot, on a highway that had proved itself to be a living, malevolent entity. The moonlight, what little of it there was, cast long, distorted shadows on the road ahead. He walked slowly, his flashlight beams sweeping over the empty blacktop. Every distant sound made him jump, every shadow made his heart race. He was a prey animal, and the road was the predator. He had walked for a quarter mile when he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, facing away from him. It was tall, impossibly thin, and dressed in what looked like the tattered remains of a uniform. Its posture was stiff and unnatural. Jake froze, his flashlight beam fixed on the figure. He didn't move for a long minute, his mind racing. Was it another hallucination? A trick of the light? Or was this another of the terrifying things from scary trucker stories' real life that had been haunting him all night? He took a slow, tentative step forward. The figure did not move. He took another, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got closer, he could see the details in his flashlight beam. The uniform looked like an old state trooper's uniform, but it was shredded and stained, as if it had been through a car crash and a fire. The figure was standing perfectly still, its arms at its sides. There was an eerie stillness about it, a silent, unnatural quiet that felt wrong. Jake's hand trembled, and he almost dropped the flashlight. He was close enough now to see its head. It was tilted at a strange, broken angle, and he could see the back of its skull, a mess of cracked bone and torn flesh. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He took one more step, and the figure slowly, with a sickening, grinding sound, turned its head. Jake's breath hitched in his throat. The face wasn't there. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a hollow, smooth expanse of dark skin that was stretched taut over a grotesque, skull-like mound of bone. It was not a missing face. It was a face that had been replaced with a terrifying, featureless mask. The face wasn't missing. It was something else entirely. Jake didn't wait to see what the faceless figure would do. He turned and ran, his boots pounding on the asphalt in a frantic, desperate rhythm. He didn't care where he was going, only that he was putting distance between himself and that grotesque thing. His chest burned, his lungs ached, but the image of the hollow, smooth face was a motivator more powerful than any fear. He sprinted until he could run no more, collapsing on the side of the road, his body racked with tremors. He looked back down the highway. It was empty. The figure was gone. He pulled himself to his feet, a renewed sense of urgency compelling him to walk. He had to find a town, any sign of life. He walked for what felt like an hour, the road a straight, silent ribbon in the night. The moon was high and bright, a cold, uncaring eye that watched his progress. The monotony of the road began to lull him into a state of semi-consciousness, a kind of waking dream. The only thing that marked his progress was the rhythmic appearance of the mile markers on the side of the road. This was one of the most chilling highway horror stories. He saw the number 14, then 15, then 16, then, to his immense confusion, he saw the number 14 again. He stopped, his mind reeling. He must have read it wrong. He walked on, counting to himself. But as he passed the next marker, he saw the number 15. He was in a loop. He turned and ran back the way he had come. But all he saw were the same markers, the same patches of gravel, the same oddly shaped trees. He was a rat in a maze, a prisoner on a stretch of asphalt that was twisting in on itself. This was the most terrifying of all the things that fall under what truckers see at 3 a.m. on empty highways. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The road had him. It was a time loop, a section of the highway that was folding space and time in on itself. He was walking the same 10 miles over and over again, an endless, monotonous journey to nowhere. He looked ahead, hoping to see something different. A bend in the road, a house, a truck stop. But all he saw was the same, familiar, unchanging landscape. He was trapped in a cycle of endless walking, his mind slowly unraveling with each step. The last mile marker was gone, but the road was not. Jake was now a man lost to time, a ghost walking a road that went nowhere. The endless loop had broken his will, his mind now a thick fog of exhaustion and terror. He had given up on running, on fighting. He was simply walking, his body moving on a primal instinct to survive, even as his hope died. The landscape repeated itself, mile after agonizing mile. The trees and the curves a mocking reflection of a reality that no longer existed. He was a prisoner of the road itself, a victim of its cruel, unending game. Just as he was about to collapse, a new light appeared in his rearview mirror. Not the sickly yellow of the phantom truck, but a sharp, clinical white. It was a police car, a wave of relief, so profound it almost brought him to his knees, washed over him, a real person, an authority figure, a way out. He stopped walking, raising his hand to flag down the officer. The car, a boxy, old model from the 70s or 80s, slowly pulled up behind him, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The car was old, but the sight of the familiar blue and red stripes on its side was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He had seen too many stories of paranormal road encounters to believe this was real, but he had to try. He turned to face the car, but something was wrong. The car was completely silent. The engine wasn't running. The tires made no sound on the asphalt. The headlights were on, but there was no light from the cab. The windows were black, like ink. He took a hesitant step toward the driver's side, his heart sinking with a terrible dread. It was another phantom. The road had sent a new trick to mess with his mind, to play with his fading hope. He backed away slowly, his hand outstretched, a silent plea for it to be real. The headlights flickered and went out. The car was gone. There was no trace of it. No tire marks, no scent of burning oil, no sound of an engine starting. Just the quiet, empty road, the same road that had been tricking him for hours. Jake stood alone on the asphalt, the memory of the phantom police car a fresh wound on his psyche. It had been an attempt to lure him into a false sense of security, to make him stop his desperate, futile march. But the silence that followed its disappearance was far more terrifying than its presence. The sirens were silent, but the warning was deafening. The phantom police car was a cruelty of the highest order, a flash of false hope designed to break what little was left of Jake's sanity. He was back on his feet, walking, but his pace was now a hollow, trudging rhythm. He was a machine fueled by pure desperation. The endless loop of the road felt less like a physical place and more like a state of mind, a psychological prison from which there was no escape. His throat was dry, his body ached, and his mind felt like a tangled web of terrifying memories and impossible visions. He saw a familiar sign, "Rest Stop 1 mile." He had seen it a dozen times, each time a beacon that led to a dead end, but this time it was different. He saw the faint, low-slung building, and beyond it, a small gas station. It was the same one from his nightmare, the one that had vanished, but it was there now. A physical, tangible place. He didn't care if it was a trap. He needed water. He stumbled toward the gas station's restroom, the door swinging open with a mournful creak. This was one of the creepy roadside encounters from Asphalt Shadows he would never forget. Inside, the light was dim and flickering. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something else, something metallic and rotten. He went to the sink, turning the spigot, but no water came out. Frustration and exhaustion almost made him break down. He looked up at the mirror above the sink, a grimy, streaked piece of glass. He saw his own face reflected back at him, pale and drawn, his eyes hollow with fear. He almost didn't recognize himself. This was one of the creepy roadside encounters from Asphalt Shadows he would have laughed at just yesterday. Now, it was his reality. He leaned forward, wiping the grime from the glass, but as his hand touched the surface, the reflection changed. It wasn't his face staring back. It was a ghastly, rotting corpse, its skin a gray and sallow mess of decay. Its eyes were two black pits, and its mouth was a silent, gaping maw of black teeth. It was the face of a man who had died in agony, and it was wearing his clothes. The image was so clear, so real, that Jake couldn't breathe. He was looking at his own dead body. The face in the mirror contorted, its silent scream a silent agony that seemed to be for him. He took a step back, his body hitting the wall behind him with a sickening thud. The mirror's surface rippled. The man in the mirror was screaming, and it was him. Jake stumbled out of the restroom, the horrifying vision of his own rotting reflection seared into his mind. He was no longer just afraid. He was a walking corpse, a man who had already seen his end. The terror of the past few hours had coalesced into a cold, clinical dread. He wasn't just on a haunted road, he was on the road to his own grave. He made his way back to his truck, the silent, black cab a final, lonely refuge. He climbed inside, a deep, bone-chilling cold settling over him. He reached for the logbook he had found in the rest area, the dead man's logbook. He had to read it again. He had to find out what had happened to Jesse, the man who had written the frantic entries. He flipped through the pages, his hands shaking, reading about the phantom truck, the gas station, the hitchhiker. He saw his own journey reflected in the pages, a mirror image of his night of terror. This was one of the true horror stories that actually happened not just to one man, but to all of them. He was living proof. He got to the final page, the last entry he hadn't fully comprehended before. The handwriting was a wild, desperate scrawl, a final testament to a man who had lost his mind. It described the faceless thing, the entity that had been haunting him all night, the one that the voice on the phone had warned him about. It called the thing a road eater, a creature that didn't just haunt the highway but was the highway itself, consuming the souls of truckers who got lost, who stopped, who lost their sanity. The final words were not about a monster or a place. They were about the end. The final entry described the road eater appearing in his cab, the face in the rearview mirror that Jake had seen himself, and the chilling realization that it wasn't just a monster, it was a reflection of the driver's own soul, twisted by fear and loneliness. The last sentence was a single, stark line: "I'm ready to become a shadow." Jake's breath caught in his throat. Jesse wasn't running anymore. He was giving in. The logbook wasn't a cry for help. It was a final confession. This was an ending he had always feared in the true horror stories that actually happened. The final page wasn't a log, it was a suicide note. The chilling suicide note of the logbook was a final, terrible gift. Jake now understood. He wasn't just being hunted, he was being broken, his sanity eroded by an entity that fed on fear and loneliness. The road wasn't just a place, it was a hungry, malevolent consciousness, and he was its next meal. He looked out the windshield, and in the distance, a figure stood on the asphalt. It was the tall, gaunt thing from the motel window, the one he had seen in his own rearview mirror, the one Jesse had written about. It was no longer a shadow. It was real. He got out of the cab, not because he wanted to, but because he knew he had to. The time for running was over. The creature began to move toward him, a slow, methodical shuffle that was more terrifying than any sprint. Its legs were long and spindly, its body a skeletal frame draped in what looked like rotted canvas. Its head was a smooth, eyeless orb, and its mouth was a dark, jagged slit that was perpetually open. It was the monster from 100 scary trucker stories real-life veterans told, and it had finally come for him. He stood his ground, the cold night air biting at his skin. He didn't scream, he didn't run, he just watched it approach, a strange, hollow calm settling over him. He was a man who had faced death in a dozen different forms tonight, and now he was facing the architect of his terror. The creature stopped just a few feet away, its head tilted to the side as if it were listening. It had no ears, but he could feel its presence inside his mind, a low, buzzing hum that promised oblivion. The hollow space where its eyes should have been began to glow with a brilliant white light. The light grew in intensity until it was a blinding, pulsating beacon of pure malevolence. He looked away, but the image was seared into his mind. He couldn't fight this thing with a knife or a gun. He couldn't outrun it. But he could do something else. He could give it what it wanted. He had to stop fighting. He had to let go. He looked back at the creature, a sudden, sick sense of understanding washing over him. The Road Eater wasn't there to kill him. It was there to make him want to die, to make him want to join the shadows. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the white light consume him. He stepped toward the creature, a willing sacrifice. This terrifying conclusion was the epitome of all scary trucker stories real life had to offer. He wasn't running from it, he was running to it. He walked into the white light, a final surrender, a silent acceptance of his fate. The Road Eater's presence was no longer a threat, it was a promise of peace, of an end to the terror, of an escape from the endless, looping nightmare of Route 666. The world around him faded, the black asphalt and the dark trees dissolving into a hazy gray as the creature's light consumed him. The last thing he heard was the soft, fading sound of a diesel engine, a sound that wasn't his own, a low hum that was more felt than heard. It was the sound of the road itself, a hungry, living thing. He was gone. Jake's truck was found 2 days later, parked perfectly on the side of Route 666, just a few yards from mile marker 13. The keys were in the ignition, the engine was cold, and the doors were locked from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, and no footprints. The authorities called it a mystery, a classic cold case, another one of the many paranormal road encounters that had become part of the road's legend. But Sam, the old trucker, he knew better. He knew exactly what had happened. He had heard the stories for decades. The logbook was found on the passenger seat, its pages turned to the final, frantic entry, a confession of a man who had given in to the road's quiet power. The receipt from the gas station was still in the cup holder, a fragile, brittle piece of paper that confirmed the impossible. Jake had become one of the shadows, a lost soul trapped on a cursed highway, another whisper in the CB static, another ghostly figure in the rearview mirror. His story was now part of the road's history. His ghost, a phantom driver, would now haunt the lonely stretches of asphalt, warning others who dared to venture onto the hungry highway. Route 666 is still out there, a ghost road that appears on no maps. Its reputation grows with every passing year, every new disappearance, every story whispered in a lonely truck stop. The road doesn't care about a name or a face. It doesn't care about a destination. It just waits. It waits for the weary, the lonely, and the exhausted. It waits for anyone who dares to stop. It waits for you. Route 66 is still out there, a ghost road that appears on no maps. Its reputation grows with every passing year, every new disappearance, every story whispered in a lonely truck stop. The road doesn't care about a name or a face. It doesn't care about a destination. It just waits. It waits for the weary, the lonely, and the exhausted. It waits for anyone who dares to stop. It waits for you.